Good morning, good afternoon, good evening from wherever you're watching us, and welcome to the Tower UNN. I will be here with you today. I'm your host. My name is Desire, and with me, I do have a guest, a co-host in the studio, Senior Chintu, who will come on and give his greetings. But I want to welcome you to the show. Hopefully, today we can all get something from this show and have a better understanding of citizenship, and how it applies to us as Ugandans in the post colonial era. But before we get into what that is and what that means and how the program will run, first we're going to get the national anthem. And after the national anthem, we'll also have a state anthem as it's within tradition of these shows. So I'll ask the producer to go ahead and please play the Ugandan national anthem.
Oh, Uganda, may God uphold thee. We lay our future in thy hand. United, free, for liberty, together we'll always stand. Oh, Uganda, the land of freedom, our love and labor we give, and we've neighbors all at our country's calling, peace and friendship.
Welcome back from the anthem. And with this, I'd like to invite Senior Chintu to come and give his greetings to the audience, and also another guest who might be able to join us later, as we're still having a little bit of technical difficulties, will be Professor Musoke Gina. But as of now, Senior Chintu, welcome to the show. Please feel free to give your regards.
Thank you very much for this wonderful introduction. Greetings to all of you watching us and listening to us on this beautiful Sunday afternoon or Sunday evening. We welcome you to this very interesting educative program of what Uganda citizenship means to all of us who are, especially those of us who are indigenous Ugandans. We need to revisit this thing because it has been badly misused in the last 30 or plus years. And we need to really take a second look at what is Ugandan citizenship and who is a Ugandan citizen, and how can we protect, preserve, and defend this God-given gift to us. Thank you very much, and I'm looking forward to a very healthy discussion with you all.
Thank you so much for that, Mr. Chintu. And for our state anthem, we're going to go with Bunyoro State, a strong nation that lived for many, many centuries, and a nation that continues to live within a concoction of a nation. So we will listen to Bunyoro State anthem and then start with our show. Welcome back from Bunyoro State Anthem, and again, welcome to the Tower UNN. And as I did say before, if you're just joining us now, I have my co-host guest in the background. Senior Chit is going to be with us today, and we're still resolving some technical issues to get Professor Musoke Gukina here with us today. But today's topic, we're going to be talking about Uganda's constitutional citizenship. And we're going to first look at the constitution that came in with this presidency or with this military occupancy, and that we have termed as Museveni's constitution in 1995. And after looking at that constitution and the articles, especially the articles in regards to citizenship, we're going to go and look at the constitution from 1962. And this was the constitution that we got before attaining independence, that was done with the UK. And then we're going to compare both those constitutions, what it means to be a citizen and what needs to be amended. And we're going to, after comparing, contrasting them, we're going to look at actually what did citizenry mean for indigenous groups at the time. What does citizenship to Uganda, what does that look like? What did that mean before the colonial era? So without further ado, we will start today's topic. If Senior Chit is here with me, we'll start with the 1995 Constitution and look at just a few specific articles. So if the producer can go to the first article, and then Senior Chintu will go into depth of what these are. So there's article number 10, which is quite straightforward, and this is citizenship by birth. So to summarize, this states that if you're born in Uganda and your parents or grandparents are members of any indigenous community existing and residing within Uganda, as the first day, uh, as at the first day of February 1926, and Senior Shinto will explain why this date is important, and set out in the third schedule to this constitution. So every person that is born in or outside Uganda, and both your parents or your grandparents were indigenous to Uganda before February 1926, so 1st February 1926, you are a citizen of Uganda by birthright. So, Senior Chintu, why is it that the date, it was made specific in this constitution, the date of February, 1st February 1926, that a person would then be considered a Ugandan citizen by birth?
Well, first of all, I have to admit I'm not a lawyer, so
Mm,
I cannot approach these issues from a legal point of view. However, that being said, I look at them from the practical point of view as a Ugandan. Now, we have a difference of opinion and a difference of what I would call a philosophical foundation of our thought. For us as Africans,
mm,
we do not base our citizenship or our belonging to a family or a tribe or a clan on
mm,
dates.
mm,
Now, when I say, like when, for example, as we Baganda generally say, we are Bazukuru ba Nambi, we are
mm,
grandchildren of Nambi. Nambi was the wife of the first king called Kintu. Okay. Now, we
mm,
do not put dates in who qualifies to be a grandchild or grandson or granddaughter of Nambi. The date doesn't matter. The
mm,
lineage, the ancestry is what matters. Now,
mm,
when we got incorporated in these so called colonial ideologies, which were
mm,
applied to us, not for the purpose of helping us, but rather for the purpose of robbing us,
mm,
then these mathematical calculations come into view and they justify whatever is that has been imposed upon us. Um, our ancestors, by that I mean those who fought for our independence and drafted these constitutions, and those who came, particularly when you look at the constitution of Yoweri Museveni, because I don't call
mm,
that a constitution of Uganda. This is a constitution of Yoweri Museveni. It was a regime plan of how they are going to dominate or take over this country, which they have done very successfully. I do not see anything to do with our originality as Ugandans, as Africans.
mm,
To me, the only way you would define it to me who is a citizen of Uganda, I would say if you belong to any of the indigenous states of Uganda, as we have had the song of the national anthem of Bunyoro, Buganda,
mm,
Acho, Karamoja, Itesot, etc., etc. To me, that would be the foundation of defining who a Ugandan is. But when you bring
mm,
in a date, 1926, what the hell does that mean?
mm,
My grandfather was by then uh, living, and my great great grandfather, they were not there during 1926. So where do you place them? Okay.
mm,
Yet I can claim my lineage to all those people who were around way back even into 17 something.
mm,
So I don't understand why they bring this date 1926. Maybe this, if this Museveni's constitution is giving us this date, I think I could say that is when the Batusi started moving into Uganda and they want to justify themselves as being Ugandans. But my definition of a Ugandan is a person who belongs to the indigenous groups that belong to this territory called Uganda.
mm. What I found interesting is that the British Constitution as well holds firm with this date, and I think it's very interesting that as Constitution, years away from independence, still has this date, because I think this is when the British finally managed to crush the Lamogi Rebellion and what was happening in Bunyoro. Because 1900 Uganda Agreement didn't settle down the country as a whole. The Banyoro were still fighting. The Langese were still fighting up in the north. They didn't have control. And this is when we start to see a more colonized idea of who a Ugandan is. So they are not even, what I found interesting in what you're saying, it's not our ancestors who have even lived in those areas from the 1700s are not even taken into account with this constitution and its definitions. And this is Museveni's constitution. But we'll move on to the next article. And this article is if the producer can go to the next article, this one I found very interesting. This is in Museveni's constitution. It's article number 11, Foundlings and Adopting Children. So it reads, a child of not more than 5 years of age, found in Uganda, whose parents are not known, shall be presumed to be a citizen of Uganda by birth. A child under the age of 18 years, neither of whose parents is a citizen of Uganda, who is adopted by a citizen of Uganda, shall on application be registered as a citizen of Uganda. But it's the first clause that's very interesting. A child of not more than 5 years of age, born in Uganda, whose parents are not known, shall be presumed to be a citizen of Uganda by birth.
Uh, yes, you are right. This is very intriguing. We know very well there were many children who
Mm,
drifted into Uganda from Rwanda
mm,
after the Kayibanda Revolution. And we
mm,
know very well that a lady called Kobusimbi
mm,
at Rubaga uh, hosted quite a number of those children. They had no parents and
mm,
they were not born in Uganda.
mm,
So this clause is accommodating such a people.
mhm,
Secondly, we have known of blatant lies, and I am going to quote a case of a person who went to Switzerland and claimed to be a person who has lost his entire family. And they gave him citizenship, or rather, a green card, if I could use that, in
mm,
Switzerland. After obtaining a green card and the permission to stay in Switzerland, within a few months, he brought his wife and the 9 children, claiming after he had received the green card, as a person who
mm,
has lost his entire family, they were persecuted, they were all killed. He's left alone. That's why he has come here to get citizens, to get asylum. It was granted to him. But within a few months, he brought his wife plus 9 children. Now, we know that there are some people who are pathological liars. They will
mm,
lie to you that I have no relative, I am alone. We have heard that from people like David Louis Rubongoya, who claims not to, who cannot tell you that my father and my mother are so and so. We have so many people like that. This clause is actually accommodating such a people.
mm,
So we have to be very careful. By the very fact that we are drifted away from our indigenous perception of what a citizen is, we made ourselves vulnerable for any manipulations, for good or bad.
yeah, and it's true what you say. If we compare just this clause to the previous clause, in order for me and you to be Ugandan citizens by birth, we have to have records of our ancestral lineage for it to be granted. Whereas in this case, all you have to do is say you have no parents. That's what I find very interesting. But we will then go ahead and move on to the next article of, again, to members of the audience, if you have just joined us, this is the 1995 Constitution, Museveni's Constitution that we're going through. And then this was Article 12, which is citizenship by registration. So every person born in Uganda, so at the time of whose birth, neither their parents and none of their grandparents had diplomatic status in Uganda. These people can register for Ugandan citizenship. Neither their parents and none of their grandparents were seeking refuge in Uganda. These people can apply for citizenship by registration. And then also, if a person has lived continuously in Uganda since the 9th of October, since 9th of October 1962, which is independence, they shall on application be entitled to be registered as Ugandans. And it continues to say that these are some of the following categories of people who can apply for registration as citizens of Uganda. This is any person who is married to a Ugandan citizen upon proof of legal and subsisting marriage of 3 years or such period prescribed by Parliament becomes a citizen of Uganda. The producer could go to the next slide, please. And then every person who has legally or voluntarily migrated to Uganda and has been living in Uganda for 10 years can then, or any other period prescribed by Parliament, shall become a citizen. Every person who, on the commencement of this constitution, meaning in 1995, when this constitution started, every person who, on the commencement of this constitution, had lived in Uganda for at least 20 years became a citizen of Uganda. And then for the next one, it says paragraph A of this clause, which is clause 2 of this article, applies also to a person who was married to a citizen of Uganda, but for his or her death would have continued to be a citizen of Uganda under this constitution. And then it continues on to say where a person has been registered as a Ugandan citizen under the paragraph A, of which paragraph A, we'll see it on the other page of clause 2 of this article. And by the way, paragraph A was that if you married a Ugandan and there's proof that you've been married to a Ugandan for 3 years, you become a citizen. And the marriage by virtue of which that person is registered has been annulled, even though you do get a divorce or void by a court, you're still a citizenship of Uganda. Your marriage has been dissolved, that person shall, unless he or she renounces that citizenship, still becomes a citizen of Uganda. So, Senior Chintu, there's specific parts that I want us to look at. A lot of interesting things in this article. If the producer could please go back to the previous one, we'll start in it slowly and then as we make our progress out of it. So this is the article on registration, and you cannot register. I will start with the clause of marriage. Marrying and legal proof of marriage to a Ugandan citizen allows for someone to be a citizen of Uganda by registration. But I want us to talk about the two clashing ideas. Marriage as it was received in our, let me say, norms, versus marriage being a constitutional right to citizenry. The conflict that is happening in between those things and what it means for people to become citizens of the state itself.
Well, that is very problematic
Mm,
because by virtue of marrying someone doesn't make you automatically a citizen. But again, we go back to this fundamental issue.
mm,
Uganda is not a country of immigrants the way you would look at a country like Canada, United States, Australia, New Zealand. No,
mm,
Uganda is not a country of immigrants. Uganda is a country of indigenous people.
mm,
These decisions must be set within the context of our authenticity as Ugandans.
mm,
And it should be upon us to define our authenticity as it relates to citizenship.
mm,
I belong to the Leopard clan, and
mm,
even if you are my friend and you really love me and like me, you cannot become a member of my clan because you are authentically, you were not born in my clan, so you cannot be. Um, being that said, You cannot become a Muganda simply because you have learned my language, and then you can claim to be a Ugandan by virtue of being associated with this one of these ethnic groups. All right? So the ethnicity should have been very paramount in our definition of who a Ugandan is. You cannot come from Machakos and be friendly to an Acholi or a Langi and automatically claim to be a Ugandan because you are married or you are associated with an Acholi or Langi. No, you are still a Mukamba and you are going to remain a Mukamba. In as much as I would remain a Ugandan, even if I have lived in Machakos for 100 years. All right? We Africans have made very big mistakes by copying what we do not understand or what is not even applicable to us. I, remind, I am reminded, thinking about this, I am reminded when I was in the School of Business Administration, one of my professors told us the philosophical differences between American business people and the Japanese business people. He said, when the Japanese go for an international business deal, they don't go to negotiate a contract. They go to get a contract. But the American business people will go into this international deal to negotiate a contract. You can
mm,
see the difference between those two opposing forces. From the Japanese mentality, we go to get the contract. The
mm,
American businessman goes to negotiate.
mm,
You see, for us as Africans, we do not believe authentically in majority vote of 51% winning, 49% losing. No, we believe in consensus.
yeah.
That's why in West Africa, they say we sit under the Borbora tree. In my area, we would say we sit under the mango tree
Mm,
and negotiate and discuss until we reach a consensus. You do not leave one party left out being doubtful about what we are trying to do to ourselves.
mm,
So if those were adopted in this thinking, we wouldn't have this problem. Now, you mentioned, why do they say anybody who has lived in Uganda since 1962? You got to remember, it was 1959, 1960 when we had an
oh,
influx of
mm,
refugees.
mm, mm. I
Now
had
you are
forgotten.
automatically qualifying them to be Ugandans. That's
Mm,
nonsense.
hmm.
That's
It
nonsense.
reminds me, we're going to get into it, but also,
Also saying those who have lived in Uganda, yes, for 20 years consecutively, yes, since 1962 we have had a big influx of
mm,
non-Ugandans moving in Uganda, and they have been there for 20 years. You are telling me automatically they are becoming citizens. All those, even though your partner or your parent could have become a citizen. Well,
mm,
how can I say if my father or my partner or my child died 2 years ago, how can you tell me if your father was still around, he would have put on this suit and this size? Well, he's dead. You cannot presume what that person who is no longer around could have
mm,
been or could have done. If your father was still around, he could have bought me a goat for Christmas. So I should get a goat for Christmas. No, you don't even know what my father could have done for you on Christmas Day because he's not here. So using that as an excuse is nothing but a lot of BS.
mm,
Now, this concept of marriage, if you've been married for 3 years, well, heck, if I'm going to marry a Pakistani, does that qualify that Pakistani to be a Ugandan? But she can live in Uganda as a Pakistani.
mm,
Now, when you look at even when you go back to that clause of 1926, my question is, when did the Indians come into Uganda to build the railroad?
mm, mm,
So if we look at when they came into Uganda to build the railroad,
mm,
the, I believe don't quote me on this because I'm not sure of the date, but I believe they came before World War II.
mm,
So are you trying to accommodate the Asians or the Indians who came to build the railroad by putting that date 1926? Because that was before World War II, and that was after World War One. So
mm,
you are seeing these funny dates being planted in there to justify a hidden agenda, either to hide the Asians who came to build the railroad or to accommodate the Tutsis who came into Uganda as they said voluntarily or as migrants before
mm,
1960. So there is a hidden agenda which is implied in these dates.
mm. But
And the
what I
most
also,
laughable, yes, the most laughable part of it is when you say children whose parents are unknown, for God's sake. What does that mean? You know, if you look
mm,
at it seriously, there is something hidden in there. And I can
mm,
imagine those children could be some of these kids that I mentioned who were raised by Muchala Kobusimbi at Rubaga, because I know some of them. We have talked
mm,
about it before. Some of them are
mm,
living here in the United States and they claim to be Ugandans.
mm,
But they came into Uganda as orphans because their parents died during the 1959-60 revolution.
mm. And I think, Senior Chintu, this goes back to what you were saying, what citizenry was to us as indigenous groups. It was more about your lineage. So they would not be a case of an unknown child, like a child just existing without a community to fall back on. But here come the British with their rules and regulations of how to structure citizenry, and then a few years down the lane, with everything that has happened, the country being up and down, the influx of refugees in Uganda, now we have a clause to accommodate for people who cannot trace back not only lineage but just even their parents. So, and that accommodation is made. But what I found very interesting is that clause about people coming in voluntarily or as immigrants, because the influx that we got in 1959, those were not people coming voluntarily and were not immigrants. Those were refugees. And there is different clauses that exist for refugees. As we saw in this constitution, I think it was the first article whereby, if the producer could please go back and pull this article. It's within the same constitution, and this article reads and says that for people whose parents, because there's different rights that are given to a person who is registering and your parents were seeking refuge in the nation. So I think it's the other side, the previous slide, producer, the previous one from this one. Yes, so it says every person born in Uganda at the time of whose birth, neither your grandparents or your parents, none of your grandparents was a refugee in Uganda. So this is, you can register as a citizen by registration if not your parents or your grandparents were not refugees in Uganda. So if your parents or grandparents were refugees in Uganda, you could not register, you cannot become a citizen by registration. But now we think of all the influx that we've had of refugees in Uganda, and how that has created a citizenry of its own outside of this very own clause.
Well, um, Desire, they
Mhm,
have bastardized the concept of refugees. When the influx of refugees came into Uganda and they were supervised by the United Nations High Commission for Refugees, they came in 1959-60. In
mhm,
19, I think it was in 1963, yeah, 1963 or 64,
mhm,
when Obote's government abolished the so-called
mhm,
refugee camps, which was not a very good decision. So the concept of refugees was terminated at that time. Many of
mhm,
them were lured into beefing up the so-called General Service Unit of Obote 1 regime. It is from that time on they were able to go to schools under the sponsorship of the Uganda government and any other means possible. Now, at that moment, technically, you could not call them refugees because they were already lured into the security services of Uganda, and the refugee camps were abolished. They were they acquired properties, namely, I will speak about Uganda, namely Namutamba area and the Chiboga area, a good many of them. And some of their products were the W. Kalema, who was a minister in Obote's government. Actually, his name was Kalema Nzira. And you have Nagenda from Namutamba area, who is still a big wheel up to this very day. I think he's still alive. So you can see these are people who should have been in the refugee camps supervised by the UN, High Commissioner for Refugees, until their home country has settled down or the troubles have quieted down, then they could be repatriated and gone back. But instead, they have stayed, and they are the cause of our problems right now. So we, we as Ugandans, lost guarding our citizenship. We lost the war of guarding what a Ugandan is. If we had committed ourselves seriously to the letter of the law, we wouldn't have this problem. And I think I said this before um, on one of our programs here that if Obote was still alive, he owes us a very big apology because he screwed up big time and set the foundation for our misery by dismantling the refugee camps for his personal gains of acquiring these people. Now, if you remember correctly, those of you who are still alive, I think it was in 1964 when Grace Bingira was elected Secretary General of Uganda People's Congress. If I have made a mistake on the dates, you can correct me. But it was somewhere around there. When Grace Bingira became Secretary General of UPC, he was lured into the American colonial interests and was given the amount of money which was secretly announced was $1 million And his plan was to take over the party and eventually become president of UPC and president of Uganda. With that money, he bought a whole bunch of Volkswagens and they used them to campaign. Now, if you remember, there was an understanding between UPC and the KY that UPC shall remain outside Buganda and the KY will remain inside Buganda. Ibingira illegally, against that memorandum of understanding, opened up branches in Buganda. And one of the people in my home area of Masaka who received one of those Volkswagens and opened up a branch of UPC in Masaka with about 3 members was the man called Karaji Zisabsoro. Those who are Masaka people will remember that name. So, and of course, eventually Obote found out and arrested them. See, these guys were infiltrating from the grassroots, and it was at the annual general meeting of UPC that his so-called branches from Buganda and other areas would beef up his campaign to take over the country. Now, that being said, you can see that the concept of citizenship was being undermined from every front,
mm,
from the legal and from the political and the practical angle.
mm,
This is a very, very big problem. Those of you who were in UPC at that time will remember these facts. And I stand by my word because I was alive, by the way, and I was alert politically and otherwise. So I know what I'm talking about.
mm,
This concept of legitimizing anybody who came into Uganda before 1962 and giving them the right to apply to become a citizen is purposely made to hide this influx of refugees who came into Uganda after the revolution in Rwanda. And
mm,
the 1926, to me, I think that was to justify the Asians who were brought in by the British to build the railway.
The Asians came in about, I think it was the beginning of that century, 1907. Around that period of time, they started coming in little by little. And then, of
Yeah,
course, we had a bigger influx, as you said, after World War One. So
that's
if
right.
we go if we go back then to this constitution, what I found very interesting about Museveni's constitution is that when it came to citizenship by registration, the biggest thing that actually one of the things, everything, all of the time, and the clauses, it says that this is a decision to be made by Parliament. And then this brings us back to the same problem that we keep on having as Ugandans, whereby Museveni's Parliament is going to decide everything, even down to who is a citizen. Just the abuse that's happening with this constitution. But before we actually go there, I wanted us to talk about this clause, and that was clause B that reads every person who has legally and voluntarily migrated and has been living in Uganda for at least 10 years or such a period prescribed by Parliament would become a citizen by registration. And then the other one that I would like for us to refer to is every person who, on the commencement of this constitution, has lived in Uganda for at least 20 years, and that this was 1995, and if we count 1995 and we count 20 years back, that takes us back to 1975. So if you've been in Uganda since 1975 or per se since 1959, and at the commencement of this institution for at least 20 years, this would make you automatically a citizen of Uganda by registration. So by the just within reference to even just this part of the article, Museveni himself would have become a citizen. Because I remember there is a video of Obote telling Museveni outright that Museveni, we don't know what you want. You're even a refugee. But just by this clause, Museveni qualifies to be a Ugandan citizen by registration.
Evidently, desire. This is a self-serving clause they put in there.
Yeah.
It has nothing to do with you and me. It is
Yeah.
definitely to serve people like Yoweri Museveni, Kayihura, as we
Mm,
found out that the father of Kayihura is the one who was also chief of the Abadehemuka. You see, you can see all these things were designed to serve a specific group of people.
mm,
It has nothing to do with the beauty and the dignity and survival of Uganda as a nation. No.
mm. With that
And by
being
the way,
said,
you talked about parliament. You mentioned the parliament, by the way. Look at the
mm,
Uganda parliament. You have
mm,
about 500 plus members. And
mm,
out of those 500 plus members, almost 300 come from Western region.
mm,
And the rest of the country, North, East, and Buganda, share the remaining 200 seats. And you call that a parliament? And if we look at the composition of all those members, you are going to find that the majority, besides those from the West, well, after all, the Western region, Kigezi and Ankole, they are already conquered territories. The
mm,
so-called Banyankole you see from there are not the real Banyankole. We
mm,
have seen faces of the real Banyankole and the Bachiga. They just don't look like the ones you are seeing now claiming to be from Ankole. Now, that being said, if you look at that 500 plus members of parliament, you are going to see that almost half of them are descendants of Abadehemuka in one way or the other. What do you expect them to vote for if a vote came around?
mm,
So, literally speaking, Uganda is an occupied country, period.
mm. So with with that being said, I think it now we should look at the 1962 Constitution because there is barely a difference in the 1962 Constitution in comparison to Museveni's Constitution because they both serve the same purpose, and that is to serve the particular group's interest. But before we get into, because for the 1962, I only flagged up one article. I'd like to invite you, Senior Chief, to flag up any more other additional articles. And before we get into it, I would love for you to give our audience members a context or take us back in that time, 1962 Constitution, the people who were going to go and negotiate this Constitution, and the aftermath of what we got. Because sometimes we have in the back of our mind that or we were fighting for independence, we had people represent us and go get this constitution, and we gloss over everything that happened because the beauty or the image that is spread for the beauty that came with independence without knowing whether we even got independence or even if this institution was independence worthy at all.
Hmm, that's a loaded question. Yes,
Mm,
every kingdom and every district was represented in the Lancaster House Conference, Constitutional Conference. But
mm,
if we look at the composition of these individual groups, who
mm,
are the people who represented Busoga? Who are the people who represented Teso? Who are the
mm,
people who represented Buganda or who
mm,
represented Bunyoro, etc., etc.? There was most of, from what we know, most of the discussions were between the British and the Buganda team. Now, who were in the Buganda team? I remember a few names, namely Michael Ochintu, who was Katikkiro, and there was Eddie Rubowa, who was Omulamuzi, and of course there was Mutesa himself, the king, and a few other names I don't remember real clearly right now. Now, if you look at the capacity of these people to negotiate for something as serious and important and sophisticated as a constitution of a new nation, it leaves you wondering. In the first place, let me start with the particular Michael Chintu. Michael, first of all, Michael Chintu was a Saza chief, a county chief. I think he was a chief of Bulemezi before he became the Katikiro. However, Michael Chintu's capacity even to understand the colonial secretary and his uh, astute aides in the Lancaster House, his capacity to understand their English is very questionable. The other one is happens to be my cousin, Eddie Ruboa. Eddie Ruboa, it's, it's laughable. I do not believe, I, I mean, I don't believe Eddie Ruboa could even understand what was going on in the Lancaster House discussions. Now, we already, of course, there were people from the political parties. The UPC party had their delegation, the Democratic Party had their delegation, and they had very, very hot exchanges of ideas and views. And we know from unwritten information, and I say unwritten because they purposely didn't want this information to be written. The Archbishop of Canterbury, working through the Katikiro and the Kabaka Mutesa with the colonial secretary, played a very, very major role in directing which way this constitution is going to look like. And some of the push and the pull discussions were very, very nasty, to say the least, between those forces. The desire from the Archbishop's point of view was to build a constitution that is a replica of what England's administration looks like. This again leads us to what we have been talking about in the last couple of days, transplanting the act of supremacy from England into Uganda, using Uganda as the channel. When Michael Chintu came back and said, "Ebyaffe twabifuna," which means we have won what we negotiated for, was nothing other than maintaining that act of supremacy, which democratic governance could not abide by. And it is unfortunate that even the UPC delegation, led by Milton Obote, for convenience and the greed of grabbing power at any cost, regardless, sided with that group. But the other delegations of Karamoja, Bukedi, Iteso, you name it, they didn't play a very, very big role in the framing of this so-called constitution. It was at that point that if you look at the annals of negotiations in Lancaster House, the Democratic Party team walked out in a,
mm,
in a disagreement with what was going on.
mm,
And those of you who want to understand this better, go and look for the letter written by the Archbishop of Canterbury to Benedicto Chuanuka. You're going to get more details on how nasty this whole thing was. So the British were steering this constitution to accommodate the recommendations from Canterbury, at the same time accommodating the Asian enclave
mm,
in dominating the Uganda economy, because everything, by the way, is economics. The British were
mm,
using the Asians as an economic entity to dominate Uganda's economy for their benefit, not to help
mm,
the indigenous Ugandans. And that's where this constitution makes its fundamental mistakes.
mm. Now, as we get into this constitution, I would like for the producer to please show up the first article of this constitution. And this was persons who became citizens on 9th of October 1962. And I know this is the first article towards citizenship. And the article reads, every person who has been born in Uganda is on 8th of October 1962 a citizen of the United Kingdom and colonies, or citizens of a British protected person shall become a citizen of Uganda on 9th of October 1962, meaning that any person who was born under British Protectorate Uganda before the 8th of October 1962, when Uganda got independence of 9th of October 1962, they automatically became Ugandan citizens. This has nothing to do with indigeneity. It has it has more to do if you were living in a British Uganda British protectorate than being a member of Uganda Kingdom. That's what I found
Yes.
very interesting about this article.
Well,
It's a
you
total
have to
dis.
remember, yeah, you got to remember that at that time we had members of the British. Let me put it simple. Any
Mm,
person who is a member of the British Empire, because
mm,
before we got independence, if you traveled overseas, you didn't travel overseas on a Ugandan passport. No.
mm,
If you went over a British subject,
mm,
I remember one of my good friends is now dead, Yunus Umpagi. Yunus Umpagi came to United States as a student on the Ben Kiwanuka scholarships. When they came, that was before independence, by the way. When
mm,
Yunus Umpagi came, they came as British subjects, and all their student affairs were handled by the British Embassy on Massachusetts Avenue. And
mm.
he told me some juicy stories, which I'm not going to talk about on the air. However, they they were British subjects, and the passports were saying members of the British Empire and British subject from Uganda. A Nigerian also traveled on a British passport as a British subject from Nigeria. A Gold Coast by then, anyway, Gold Coast became Ghana in 1959. So they were lucky. But Tanzania or Tanganyika or Kenya or whatever, you were a British subject from Tanganyika or from Kenya, not a Kenyan citizen. There was no Kenyan citizenship. Now, we had people from India, Pakistani, Ceylon, which is now Sri Lanka, um, and all the countries that belong to the British Empire. Many of them were living in Uganda. What they are trying to tell us is that any of those people who belong to the British Empire and the Republic of Ireland, and they happen to be found in Uganda the day before our independence, automatically they become Ugandan. Doesn't that
Mm.
include Meta and Madivani and the rest and the
Mhm.
Patels? That's what it is um, uh, pointing at. Now, we had also people from other countries like uh, Sierra Leone, not many Nigerians or Sierra Leone or Ghana. By then, Ghana had become independent in 59, 57. In any case, anybody who was a member of the British Empire automatically qualifies to be a Ugandan. And they are not addressing about the authenticity of a Ugandan. No, this
Mhm.
is designed to accommodate these momboze, what do you call that in English? Call it foreigners.
Foreigners, yeah.
Or in Lingala, we call them Bapaya. They are foreigners. So they
Mm.
were being accommodated by this clause, and it had nothing to do with those of us who were born and raised in Maokota or in Iganga or Okumi. No.
Mm. So that same clause continues to say, every person who, having been born outside Uganda, is on the 8th of October 1962 a citizen of the Ugandan Kingdom and the colonies or British Protectorate person shall, if his father becomes, or would but for his death have become, a citizen of Uganda in accordance with the provisions of subsection 1 of this section, become a citizen of Uganda by 9th of October 1962. So it's within the same lines of the first one that we read, that if you were part of the British Empire, or if your father was part of the British Empire before 8th of October, if they died a member of the British Empire by 8th of October, you automatically would have become a citizen of Uganda by 9th of October 1962. That is very interesting.
Well, yes, it is interesting because if you look at the Asians of that time, some
Mm,
Asians came into Uganda and they
mm.
started living there, but they left a good
Their
many
family.
of their family members back home. Now that means you can call them up, hey, hurry up. I have
Yeah.
already I'm already here. And they would come and they take over the whole town of Uyikwe or Nakasongola. And before
Mm,
you know it, the whole town is full of Asians. That's what
mm,
they did. And and by the way, that served them very well.
mm. Because they were able to build themselves up economically off of these clauses. But Senior Chinchi, now I'd like to invite you if there's any other specific articles that you would like for us to read from the 1962 one.
Well, I like to dwell on the 1962
Mm,
simply because it has a historical
mm,
significance
mm,
because in spite of all the deficiencies they had in there, the representatives of all our states, the 16 or 15 states that make Uganda, agreed
mm,
that we are all going to come together and form a new nation called Uganda.
mm,
That I cannot sneeze at. We have to respect that. However, there are some flaws in that constitution which need to be amended. I strongly believe that we Ugandans, and I'm not talking about simply ganging together a whole bunch of people in Kampala the way Museveni does, but I'm talking about going back in our indigenous states, in Karamoja, in Teso, in Bunyoro, in Ankole. Let us sit down, as Professor Gukina suggested. Let us sit down in our nation states, which make Uganda. Discuss seriously, what does being a Ugandan mean to us? How do we want to look like? How do we want to govern ourselves? In my writings, I have always used the reference of the United States that when those guys fought against the British colonialism, they locked themselves up in a building on a very hot summer day in Philadelphia. Now they call it the Independence Hall. They sat there, and the question at their mind was, now we are getting rid of the British colonialism. How do we want to govern ourselves?
mm,
They spent a few days in that hot and humid room, pounding their heads. And when I look at the Constitution of the United States, which I, by the way, have a copy of it here,
mm,
they looked at each other and they discussed it seriously for a few days until they came up with a conclusion.
mm,
And the conclusion started, we, the people of the United States, in order to form a more perfect union, establish justice, ensure domestic tranquility, provide for the common defense, promote the general welfare, and secure the blessings of liberty to ourselves and our posterity. Do ordain and establish this Constitution for the United States of America. There is no
mm,
other statement which is as beautiful as that. They are not talking about accommodating refugees from Rwanda or Indians who came to build a railway. No, they are talking about we, the people. How are we going to govern ourselves so that we can live in domestic tranquility with justice and, and the welfare of our people?
mm,
Can we, as Ugandans, reach that level of understanding and they
mm,
say, we the people of Uganda, meaning you from Acholi, Lugbara, Karamajong, Yitesot, Langi, Musoga, Shu, Baganda, Ankole, we want to build a republic whereby we take care of the welfare of the
mm,
people, that we take care of the tranquility, domestic peace, not turning on the television or radio and hear somebody has been, his head has been chopped off, or the tear gas has been spilled on people in Buikwe or Bugerere. I mean,
mm,
can we build a peaceful nation whereby we guarantee the security of everybody, whereby nobody is dying of hunger in Karamoja or his
mm,
cows being taken away from there to Rakitura? Can we build that nation? The answer is yes, but we
mhm,
cannot build it with this kind of occupying forces from Rwanda. We cannot. We have
mm,
to get rid of these people first and foremost and sit down in our, we can start with our groups. Let the Karamajongo sit down. Let the Itesot sit down. Let the Banyoro sit down and give us their authentic way of looking at each other and how they would want to see living in peace.
mm,
And by the way, if we can build that kind of peaceful society, even a foreigner who is looking for refugee status will be welcome and we shall take
mm,
care of him as a refugee.
mm,
But he's not going to determine how I lay my bed. That's my business because this is my house. You come
mm,
as a refugee, we shall take care of you as a refugee. We shall keep you in the refugee camp. If the UN comes to help us, yes. But we take care of our house.
mm. This brings me to a final question for Uganda. Sorry, not for Uganda, but for this show. It seems as though when you look at both of these constitutions side by side, there is a copy paste, but then just a slight edit depending on the purposes. And this makes me question all these years since 1962, and then all the wars that happened with every leader that did come into place was to change the status quo, to change what Uganda has been post colonially and make it better for people. But even throughout that whole period of time, we're still having a constitution that is very similar to the constitution that was given to us by the British. It doesn't drift so far away from the idea of a constitution that serves a third party and doesn't serve and undermines actually the power of the people that is fused into this constitution itself. There is a disregard for Ugandans who are actually Ugandans, who are indigenous to their, it's like they don't exist in this constitution, but it claims to represent those groups or those people. And if we can compare, contrast, first of all, them being aligned together, these two constitutions, and then the idea of citizenry or citizenship as in terms of in our indigenous norms and traditions and how people were assigned to different areas or different places. And also, lastly, if we talk about how even nations like Uganda had been receiving refugees for a long period of time before even the British came, just to highlight to our audience members that there is within our traditional norms ways to receive visitors, foreigners in within the region due to different calamities or pushes and pull forces that bring them into the area. But and that citizenry is provided for, but not in the terms of these two constitutions. I think those are about three questions. I apologize in one if they're a bit confusing.
Well, yes, Desire. The 1962 Constitution, as I said, I give it respect, but it
Mm,
has a lot of flaws which need
mm,
to be amended.
yeah.
And the British, I don't want to be presumptuous, but I think the British made sure
Mm,
when they were designing this constitution that they put in what I would call a sleeping earthquake. One day that
mm,
earthquake is going to explode.
humble. Yeah.
And among the sleeping earthquakes which they put in that constitution was first, they gave Uganda a federal status, and they
Mm,
gave other kingdoms like Ankole, Toro, Bunyoro, and Busoga, I believe, semi federal status. Then they gave the rest of the country no federal or semi federal status. Now, how can you build a nation with such a built in controversial elements? West Nile, Acholi, Lango, Karamoja, Kigezi were not given any of those. They were left to be administered based on what you would call a unitary form of government. You cannot, it's just like saying you can't be half pregnant. You are either pregnant or you ain't. Okay? These areas have federal, one has federal, the other one has semi federal, and the other ones are unitary. Come on. That's why we are advocating for a federal status for every area of the country, because this Katogo or this mix up is counterproductive. That has to be corrected. There are many areas which have to be revisited in this constitution. And I strongly believe that if we put our heads, and by the way, when I say putting our heads, let's avoid this mumbo jumbo of we want lawyers, because they're going to give you a lot of so-called textbook bullshit. And they got plenty of it. We have seen it, we have heard it. That's not what we are talking about. We do not want text bullshit. We want common sense wisdom. Whether you are a lawyer, or you are a nurse, or you are a farmer, as long as you have the brains in you, let us look at common sense wisdom and come to a consensus as Acholis, as Langis, as Banyoro, as Baganda, and contribute to what is going to bring peace, stability, and development within our society without compromising our cultures and the traditions. This idea of modernity, which to me is nonsense, because if the white people can walk around with their behinds on the beach, that doesn't mean that our girls in Masaka should walk around with their in the bikinis showing us their behinds. That's not, and other people are going to say, hey, yeah, but this is modernity. Bologna. It ain't modernity. It is desecration of our cultures and the norms. Period. We must, we can improve, we can develop without compromising our cultures, our values. Among our values is we do not intermarry within our own clans. Although some of these foreign tribes which have floated into our country, they can marry their sisters or cousins or nephews. We don't do that. So we should maintain our cultures, our traditions, in spite of our advanced education and economic progress, which we are achieving on a daily basis.
Thank you so much for that, Senior Chintu. And with that being said, we're going to go into a short break. And then when we do come back, for those of you whilst we're at the break who have the studio number, please feel free to send in your voice note, your questions, and we'll answer them after we come back from the break. For those of you who don't have it, it will be pinned up to the screen, and feel free to send in your questions, and we'll make sure to answer them after we come back from this break.
The importance of a federal system of governance in Uganda. 1. Federalism restores peace and regional stability. 2. Federalism promotes political participation. 3. Federalism encourages economic development across the country. 4. Federalism provides multiple levels of government action. 5. Federalism accommodates a diversity of opinions. 6. Federalism protects against tyranny of the majority. 7. Federalism promotes unity without imposing uniformity. Register today and join the UFCC Assembly by visiting www.ufcc.uk. Why do we need the federal system of governance in Uganda? And what is federalism? Federal is a system of governance. It's not about getting rid of the central government. It's not about party politics. It's not about multi-partisan or absence of it. It's not about religious differences. It's not about tribalism. It is not for the benefit of Buganda alone. It's not about monarchism. It's not about land or dispossessing people from land. It is not about supremacy of one region over another or others. It's about helping the central government to provide services more efficiently and provide more effective development to the people. It's about sharing power and responsibilities between the central government and regional governments. Federalism is about providing more prosperity, more wealth, more feeling of belonging and participation in governance by marginalized and non-marginalized people. The federal system of government minimizes possibilities of waging war against the central government. It minimizes internal acts of terrorism and discontent against the central government. It has inbuilt safeguards that ensure uniform growth for all regions of the country, and additional measures to make sure that the marginalized or less developed regions of the country can catch up through the system of equalization grants and affirmative action programs. This ensures that the regions with greater income and development contribute a percentage of their earnings to the developed areas which may be less developed. It should be noted that federalism, though different from decentralization, does not contradict or exclude decentralization. The two systems can and should coexist and complement each other at the regional level. Advocating federal does not mean or seek to get rid of decentralization from regional tier. Nor does it mean getting rid of district MPs, LC leaders, or other regional government officials. To learn more about federalism, register and join UFCC at www.ufcc.uk.
Welcome back from that small break. And due to a little bit of technical difficulties, sadly, Senior Tunes, today we're not going to be able to get calls, questions, or messages from our audience members. But we hope to, not next week, because next week we have a different show aligned, but the week after next week to pick up on this conversation. And then and on that day we will receive questions, so that's in about 2 weeks. For people who would be interested or still have their questions, we would answer them at that point in time. But with that being said, from today's show, what I found very interesting, what you say, is we don't even have to go back to all these other constitutions, Museveni's constitution or Bote's Pigeonhole constitution. We need to go back to the 1962 constitution to respect and abide the fact that Ugandans, indigenous Ugandans from every state, managed to come together under the band of unity to redefine who a Ugandan is. We need to go back to that textbook, but this time not as colonial subjects, but as Ugandans, and rewrite our constitution. So I hope that everyone in the audience managed to take this and more from today's show. With that being said, Senior Chief, it's always a pleasure being with you here. And, you shed light and have experienced Uganda in so many of its vast stages. Even now, just 10 years from now, asking you your experience of Uganda as a Ugandan in the diaspora would be if further intriguing, if God does give us, that time and the life on this earth. But with that being said, I'd like to invite you to bid your farewell to our audience members today. And thank you so much for being with me here today in the studio to elaborate on these issues.
Thank you, Desire, for that good conclusion. Um, our dear brothers and sisters watching us or listening to us today. I hope that you have been able to pick up something you didn't know before. And with that, you were able to formulate your mindset so that we can look at Uganda and where it is so that we can also plan where it is going to be. It is always very important. You have to know where you came from so that you can know where and why you are here, and then be able to plan where you want to go next. If you make a mistake in that analysis, then you are bound to fail in whatever you do. As they say, nobody plans to fail, but people fail to plan. We have a big job to do to rescue our country. It has been taken over. Literally, it has been taken over. When I see pictures of people who claim to be from some regions, I just wonder. Not too long ago, I saw some clips on social media of people who were claiming to be representing coffee farmers. In the first place, you know, I am from Masaka, and if there is any region in Uganda which can be proud of being a coffee farmers, we, the Banabudu, should take the first prize. Plus Bugishu. Those are the areas which are known for being a coffee farmers. But when I saw someone that has been working on, I think it was a New Vision newspaper for some years, and just recently he drifted out of there, and now he's pretending to be representing the coffee farmers. I mean, if I was around, definitely I would kick his butt because there is no word to use when you are talking about defending our coffee farmers. There was nobody from among the Banabudu who are traditionally prominent coffee farmers, no Remugishu, but some jackass who may have drifted into Uganda recently and now claims to be a Munyankore when he is not even a Munyankore for that matter. Come on, Uganda has been taken over. And we, the indigenous people, have a specific job to do, starting with not now, yesterday, to rescue our country, redefine ourselves, and now sit as independent, indigenous Ugandans and formulate where we want to go, how we want to govern our country. And that's a job which you and I and everybody listening must do. Stop listening to people who are out there looking for 5 million shillings a month if they become members of parliament, or who are just locked up in these Badehemuka girls because they are misleading you. People, wake up. We have to rescue Uganda. Thank you very much. And I hope to see you again next time.
Thank you so much, Senior Changer, for that. And I would like to let everyone know that coming up next, Senior Gombia is going to be in the studio. He is back at it. So tonight with Henry Gombia is coming right after this, right after we get off the air, and is going to be hosting his guest Yoga Adola. So make sure to tune in for that right after the tower. It won't be very long before that show comes on. So make sure you tune in. But with that being said, I want to thank everyone who's been with us from where we started to where we are at, where we ended the show. As Senior Chintu said, I hope that you managed to learn something new. But the most important part that he said, self-determination is it's two things. Number one, we're living within occupied territory, but not only occupied, but militarily occupied territory. Three, number two, self-determination is key, and we need to sit down as citizens or indigenous peoples to to these areas or these lands that our ancestors have had past time immemorial and have lived on that territory, and then start to define where we want to go as a nation in the band of unity. Hence why here we talk about federation and federalism and as it applies to Uganda's indigenous communities. But with that being said, thank you for being here, and hopefully we'll see you next Sunday, similar time, for the Tower at UNN. Until then, mana mukama abakuume, atakumira mpeera. May the Most High watch over you, and until next week.